Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program with visiting critic Nancy Princenthal. Once again, we are thrilled to be here in the Griffin Concert Hall of the University Center for the Arts, and we're delighted to have you with us. Tonight's lecture is part of the Department of Arts Critic and Artist Residency series. This series, founded by an anonymous endowment called the FUNd at CSU, brings prominent artists, writers, and curators to Colorado State University for public lectures, informal discussions, and intensive work with undergraduate and graduate students. I'm honored to be here this evening to introduce one of the most prolific art critics of our time, Nancy Princenthal. Princenthal has had an extraordinary career as a writer, teacher, and curator. Currently, she is senior editor for the publication Art in America. She has been with us in Fort Collins for a couple of days, and I'd like to thank her for her kindness and her work with graduate students and undergraduate classes. Princenthal received her BA at the University of Pennsylvania and her MA in art history from Hunter College. She has taught extensively with visiting lecturer and visiting critic positions at Princeton University, where she lectured from 1994 to 2004, the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, Yale University, Bard College, and the University of Texas at Austin. She has also held a number of curatorial positions, including work on exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art. However, it is in the field of art criticism that Nancy Princenthal has excelled. In her numerous articles, texts, and catalog essays, Princenthal's insightful analysis of contemporary art has assisted us with understanding the culture of our time. Princenthal has written for Art in America since 1986, contributing feature articles on both established and emerging contemporary artists, including Vito Acconci, Janine Antony, Stephen Balkan All, Scott Burton, David Hammonds, Cornelia Parker, Martin Puryear, and Rachel White-Reed, among many, many others. She has also brought her perceptiveness to critical art world events and exhibitions, including the Whitney Biennials, the opening of Dia Beacon, and the plans for the World Trade Center Memorial. Princenthal's writings have appeared in many other publications, including the New York Times, Parquet, Art US, Sculpture Magazine, Art Forum, and the Village Voice. In addition, Princenthal has authored over 40 book and catalog essays. Her most recent publications include texts on Alfredo Yarr, Catherine Lee, and Petit Coin. In 2000, her beautiful essay on sculptor Doris Salcedo appeared in a monograph on the artist's work. Nancy Princenthal has said, quote, "If there's one thing I'm certain of in criticism, it's that everything matters. There is no single comprehensive way to talk about art or artists. Advocacy, information, analysis, catharsis, simple human contact, whatever art can offer," end quote. This holistic and encompassing approach is evident each time a new issue of Art in America with a Princenthal article appears on the stands. Nancy Princenthal's penetrating examinations of contemporary art and artists and her intuitive understanding of visual culture make her one of the most important voices in the art world today. Please join me in welcoming our visiting critic, Nancy Princenthal.
Thank you, Linny, for that exceedingly generous introduction, and thank you, Linny, and the faculty here at Colorado State also for inviting me to be here. I've been having a wonderful time. It's been glorious to be in Fort Collins, and I've seen some terrific work, so thank you to the students whose studios I had the chance to visit. I think it's only fair that I begin by saying, which some of you already know, this talk is billed as a lecture about dreams and art, which is a lecture I really wanted to give It's a subject I'd love to know more about myself. I've been interested in neuroscience for a very long time. Some of you already know that I've been married to a neuroscientist for a pretty long time. And I had this idea that the two disciplines had finally gotten to the point where there was something really constructive that they had to say to each other. And I think we're almost there, but my research in the period between agreeing to do this lecture and giving a title for it and actually standing here tonight has demonstrated that although we know more than we used to about what dreams are, how they function, what they're for, and neuroscientists have been able to answer some really important questions about what parts of the brain and body are active when we dream, which is incredibly interesting. We still don't really know a whole lot about what dreams look like, which is what I was most interested in, because it's always struck me that the way artists represent dreams and our own sort of, I think, daily introspective reports about what we see when we dream are not necessarily the same thing. In any event, it's still true, and is likely to be true for some time to come, that we are reliant on conscious waking reports in verbal language, about what dreams are, and so are really, for the time being, unable to have actual access to what the sensory experience of being in a dream state is like. So much for my apology for the distance between the title of the talk and what it's going to be like, what it's going to be about. A lot of the mystery involved in dreaming leads to questions about the nature of consciousness and the nature of human consciousness in particular, insofar as that is a different kind of thing from, say, other animal consciousnesses, or, in fact, whether animals can be said to have consciousness at all. Which, again, is not really the subject of this lecture, but what I will be talking about is the very hazy human-animal divide, and specifically about how animals and humans have been linked in art. Animal-human hybrids are as old in art as representation, and they in fact speak of the earliest impulses for art making, honoring the spirit and power that resides in things non-human. They're common enough, and this is one of the things that got me confused in the early stages of this research, to be considered as among the collective symbols that some have believed central to the human collective unconscious, also a contested term. We associate hybrids readily with both dreams and hallucinations, but in fact, and this is a thing we do seem to know, goat-legged, cat-headed, or otherwise hybridized people don't actually appear with any frequency in human dreams or hallucinations, which, as I'm sure most of you know from simple introspection, favor things that are very familiar, things that actually exist in waking life. Those are the things that populate our dreams. Hybrids, however, have been everywhere in religion and art, and they are, as it happens, having a little renaissance in contemporary art. Some of the artists that I'll be talking about, the contemporary artists, are Rona Pondok, whose image you've seen on the poster around the art school, Kiki Smith, Stephen Balkan All, Ann Chu, Marcel Zama, Matthew Barney, and Patricia Piccinini. And for precedents, all of these artists can look back to a near infinity of sources, to Surrealists, to Picasso, a host of other modernists, many of whom themselves were looking to classical themes that represented the hybrid figures that have come to us from Greek and other mythological systems. Maybe the best term for drawing together the work sharing this basic theme isn't dreaming at all, but rather enchantment. Enchantment is a word that suggests that animals and trees and flowers and even rocks and planets and stars can dream themselves and are not so far from awareness and agency as we generally think. That's a place where art started with that belief, and I think it's still actually an extremely powerful one. It may not be as big a part of every modern system of thought or even religion as it once was, but it is certainly an enormous, if only implicit, part of the continuing, hard-to-explain drive to make paintings and sculptures. A drive that can be also described as the desire to breathe life into paint and metal and stone, and for that matter, into microcircuitry. One of the very first known artworks, this Paleolithic lion-headed person, is a hybrid. It's believed to be about 32,000 years old. It was carved out of a mammoth tooth, which gives you some idea of where in the course of human history it stood. It was likely carved using a stone knife. It's about 10 inches high. Its pieces were found in 1939 in a cave in Germany. Interpretation is extremely difficult. Even its gender is indeterminate. There are certain similarities to French cave wall paintings, which also show hybrid creatures, but those are several thousand years younger. There's a similar but smaller lion-headed sculpture that's been found in another cave in the same region in Europe, along with other animal figures. Perhaps the lion-headed person played an important role in the mythology of the early Paleolithic. We know almost nothing about this figure, except that it stands at the very dawn of what I guess we can call art making. Stephen Mithen, the author of a book called The Prehistory of the Mind, The Cognitive Origins of Art, Religion, and Science, who cites this lion person as one of the earliest known artworks, thinks the creative explosion of the Upper Paleolithic came about when relatively separate cognitive modules for social relationships, nature, and tool making, among others, came together. This is a process I can only dimly imagine, how these modules can have been separate and how they could have come together. And he believes that that's represented in some way in this figure. In any case, I think you can't help wondering if at this point, when this hybrid figure was made, humans could have been very securely distinguished from animals at all. Moving forward about 30,000 years, we find that hybrids still abound. This is one of the most popular exhibits at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's one half of the Neo-Assyrian lion gates. These have human heads and the bodies of winged lions, and were made somewhere around 885 BC. Similarly, the Egyptian Sphinx of Hatshepsut from about 600 years prior, from roughly 1470 BC, marshals the powers associated with an animal. These very, very majestic images that come to us from that part of the world, from the ancient Mideast, often involve an animal of very significant menace and also potency, a big cat in this case, a power that's marshaled on behalf of individual and communal well-being and power. These are images connected with the divine power of a secular ruler. They associate humans with the dignity, the physical prowess, and also the natural dominion of powerful animals. But they're also, in a way, propitiatory. They're meant to honor and also even to placate these very threatening kinds of beasts. On the other hand, from a very different spiritual system, this is Ganesha, an animal-headed human, so something of the opposite, which comes from Hinduism, in which gods have human foibles, supernatural powers too, rather than the other way around, rather than the previous representations of humans being given godlike attributes. This 10-armed sandstone Ganesha, which is a little over 4 feet high, is from the 8th century AD. And I was privileged to see several wonderful Ganeshas in my visit on Sunday to the Denver Art Museum. Those are actually in the older part of the museum. In any case, Ganesha, as some of you may know, is the son of Shiva and Parvati. He's one of the most popular of Hindu deities, worshipped as the god of good luck, the remover of obstacles. Elephants are very important in Hindu cosmology, in which the earth is carried on the back of an elephant, which is in turn carried on the back of a tortoise, which I think is pretty wonderful. Ganesha has an elephant head because Shiva and Parvati quarreled after Ganesha refused his father's request to see Ganesha's wife while she was bathing. So Shiva cut off his son's head I think it tells you something about a different relationship to gods and their behavior, and is common in Western religions. But Parvati was so grief-stricken that Shiva agreed to replace his son's head with the head of the first animal he saw, which happened to be an elephant. This is a smaller copper alloy Ganesha from the 11th century. These figures were often carried, or meant to be carried in processions, temple processions at the forefront, and were essential to temple festivals. Moving back to the Mediterranean, this is a stela of a youth, and it's a grave marker, of a youth and a little girl, which is topped by a sphinx. Sphinx having traveled across the Mediterranean, in this case become secularized, used to mark a actual grave site. In Greek myth, there is access to power through animal spirits, as for instance in the apotropaic, the scary, inducing snakes of Medusa, as well as pleasure, as for instance with the goat-legged, human-bodied satyrs, in whose guise the late Picasso pictured himself. But in Greek mythology, and particularly in Greek hybrids, there is also heedless dissipation that leads to punishment. This very famous metope from below the pediment of the Parthenon in Athens, it comes from roughly a century after that grave marker that I just showed, depicts the battle of the centaurs and the Lapiths. In the British Museum's wonderful description of this marble, the battle which the heroic Lapiths won against the inebriated centaurs allegorized the struggle, this is the British Museum quote, between the civil and the savage side, close quote, of early civilizations. In Ovid's Roman versions of the Greek myths, hybridization most often happens when the gods misbehave and punish each other. Actaeon was transformed into a stag for looking at Diana while she bathed in a woodland pool, and a curse intended to prevent him from talking about her, talking about what he had seen. Ovid writes, "Antlers she raised upon his dripping head, lengthened his neck, pointed his ears, transformed his hands to hooves, arms to long legs, and draped his body with a dappled hide, and last, set terror in his heart." It's a kind of imagery that I think still is extremely evocative. What happened to Actaeon after that was that he was torn apart in the guise of a deer by his own dogs, which is a pretty brutal way to go. Arachne was, in a not altogether dissimilar way, transformed into a spider by the jealous Minerva. When Peleus, as Jove's proxy, tried to rape Thetis, she, and this is also a quote from Ovid, resorted to her arts and changed her shape so often he'd have gained the end he dared. But first she was a bird, that bird he held, and then a sturdy tree. That tree he fastened on. Her third shape was a stripy tigress. Peleus, terrified, released his hold on her and let her go. In a fascinating 2002 book called Fantastic Metamorphoses, Other Worlds, Marina Warner, a pretty wonderful writer, explains that the interactions in Ovid between humans, animals, and elements of the landscape, which are in constant flux, are based on Pythagoras' notion of the transmigration of souls, whereby no thing or being dies, but instead is sort of endlessly transubstantiated, one being's soul sort of moving into another body. For the Greeks, this kind of endless instability is the mode of the gods, but Warner says that in Christianity, by contrast, heaven and beatitude are states of fixity. It is hell that is characterized by instability. So, for instance, Dante's hell looks a lot like the state of the world described by Ovid. I think it's one of her lovelier insights, as is clear in this, one of the very famous illustrations that Gustave Doré made for Dante in the latter part of the 19th century. This is from 1867, an illustration of Dante's Purgatory in which a sinner has met Arachne's fate and been transformed into a spider. Warner also, in a very interesting analysis, says that Bosch, who obviously used an awful lot of hybrid imagery, Bosch knowingly combined Ovid's Metamorphoses with recent to him, that is early 16th century, reports of natives of the New World, as relayed by a friar who is in the employ of Columbus. So there were similar tales filtering back to Europe of pagan promiscuity and relations among animals and people and the natural world in this newly discovered territory across the ocean. Warner says that one way of looking at Bosch's terrifying hybrids, as for instance in this Temptation of St. Anthony, which is from around 1505, is as a kind of hybridization of imagery that came to Bosch from both a close reading of Ovid and from these newly published or newly circulated stories of the New World and the terrible, terrible things that unfamiliar non-white people were doing in those mysterious, exotic places. On the other hand, Warner says, the dove associated with the Holy Spirit of Catholicism descends, and I don't know whether there is any other person out there analyzing this particular symbolism this way. She says that the dove of the Holy Spirit descends from the Greek Zeus, who took the form of a swan when he impregnated Leda. Birds actually are of significant spiritual importance in a great number of religions. Finally, from Warner is also this observation that, and an observation that's very important for contemporary art, that the parallel between the metamorphoses that have come down to us from classical and earlier narrative traditions and the metamorphic transformations that are fundamental to the business of art making have a parallel. In art, metamorphosis is both subject and method. And this is a quote from Warner, as if the poets and writers intuited the correspondence between metaphor's work of metamorphosis and the gods' changes of shape, close quote, and I think that's a very potent insight. To move from literary theory to philosophy, and bear with me, this is going to be a little bit of a digression in which we will stray from actual imagery. There's a really fascinating recent book. It was published in 2004 by the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, which is called The Open, Man and Animal. And it's a slim little volume in which this philosopher explores the relationship between humans and other animals across cultures and across several philosophical systems. He writes, in the Ancien Regime, the boundaries of man are much more uncertain and fluctuating than they will appear in the 19th century, after the development of the human sciences. Up until the 18th century, language, which would become man's identifying characteristic par excellence, jumps across orders and classes, for it is suspected that even birds can talk. So one of the things that comes up when you do research about the sort of symbolic links or symbolic hybridizations between animals and humans is this fluctuating series of dates meant to say when relations between animals and humans change significantly, when the human organism was identified in contrast to nearest animals as having distinct capabilities, and when those boundaries were seen to collapse. There's not a whole lot of agreement about that. Of course, even now, the boundary between people and animals is not secure, far from it. The question of whether animals have consciousness in the sense that humans do is very vexing. So is the question of whether they have an equivalent use of language. In any case, Agamben's perspective is distinctive. He looks not so much at what behavioral physiological research shows, but at how culture has framed that relationship, and how cultural definitions have been aimed at shaping experimental ones. And one idea that he addresses at length is Martin Heidegger's, and here it gets a little thorny, but bear with me. Heidegger's concept of what he calls the open. It's a word that Heidegger uses for the field of existence. The open is just a field of sensory experience, and non-human animals' relations to it. When Heidegger wrote it had been suggested by ethological fieldwork that animals' perceptual worlds and the way they meet their needs in some way blur the edges of their physical beings. It's a kind of tricky concept. But what it means in an example is that the spider's web is determined by the physiology of the of the fly it's meant to trap, as much as it's determined by the physiology of the spider doing the trapping. So in that sense, Heidegger described animals as being captivated by their environments, captivated by the other elements in their worlds, in the same way that the spider's web is itself caught by the fly, completely consumed by a relationship that precludes agency. And Heidegger believed that that is what distinguishes animals from humans. On the one hand, this is a quote, "Captivation is a more spellbinding and intense openness than any kind of human knowledge. On the other, insofar as it is not capable of disconcealing its own disinhibitor," a bunch of negatives there, "it is closed in a total opacity," close quote. In other words, precisely by being so open to its world with an innocence that blocks critical processes of awareness, in other words, the spider can't understand the elements in its world that disinhibit it, the animal is locked in a kind of profound ignorance that distinguishes it from humans. In a kind of funny aside, Heidegger believed that the relationship of animals to their world is closely paralleled in humans by the experience of boredom, of all things, when humans similarly find objects closed down to their understanding, unyielding to conscious enjoyment or even utility. On the other hand, and this is where it comes back to the subject of tonight's lecture, captivation, in the work of art, captivation yields something completely different. And here he uses the term world to mean known environment, and says, this is Heidegger, "The stone is worldless. Plant and animal likewise have no world, but they belong to the veiled throng of an environment in which they have been suspended. But in the work of art, the closed comes to light as such." And so here's sort of, I think, the tasty morsel for the purposes of considering the relations between animals and humans in contemporary artwork. And this is a quote from Heidegger: "The artwork moves the earth itself into the open of a world and keeps it there." Close quote. In other words, it gives unknowing matter, everything from rocks to beasts, some form of sentience, collapsing the difference between positions on the spectrum between stone and human. And I think it's clear that Heidegger's discussion brings this consideration very close to the field of anthropology, which has concerned itself with animism, with how tribal artifacts can be understood to have a kind of agency, to both represent and partake of the spirits of the animals and humans that they represent. I consulted a book by a man named Michael Taussig on the subject of magic and animism in Central American tribal culture, a very interesting book in which Taussig ends by talking about fetishism fetishism as it's used in tribal culture, that can be equated with the term fetishism as Marx used it, to refer to the capitalist attributes of commodities, which is a point that the art historian W.J.T. Mitchell comes to also. Mitchell has written a fascinating book called What Do Pictures Want?, in which he argues that the kind of animism that was found in the earliest examples of art, and I think this argument could go all the way back to the 32,000-year-old lion person that I showed at the beginning, that kind of animism is very much alive today. He writes, this is Mitchell, I believe that magic attitudes towards images are just as powerful in the modern world as they were in the so-called ages of faith. And though he doesn't address hybrids specifically, he makes references to the challenges placed by new technologies, to old boundaries between animate and inanimate, including, and I'll come back to this toward the end, artificial intelligence, cloning, and subatomic physics. And about animals, Mitchell does say, and I think this is interesting, the living origin of language is in metaphor, and the first metaphors, as commentators from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to John Berger have remarked, were animals. Things closest at hand, things most available for simile, for comparison to what we humans were experiencing, but available as different enough to stretch the meaning of a known term. Animals were markers for the caesura between fact and idea. That's what a metaphor does, is it makes a link between a known thing, a fact with a securely attached name label, and something that doesn't yet have a stable name, stable meaning. And I think it's fascinating that animals made that process of metaphor possible. Certainly to Rousseau, it was humans that, probably to Berger as well, it was humans that in that transition were the fact, and animals that made the metaphor possible. In fact, in the essay that Mitchell was referring to, Berger kind of takes the animal side of that position. It's a wonderful essay written about 30 years ago called Why Look at Animals? And he answers his own question by saying, simply, we look at animals because they no longer exist in our lives. Farming has been industrialized, and this, he was writing 30 years ago. Animals in the wild are ever more remote, endangered, and hard to see. I think all of that is inarguable. And while this has been happening, Berger says it's been taking centuries, animals have become more and more common as symbols. Berger says that Descartes' dualism paralleled the separation of man from animal when animals were equated with dumb bodies. So he's making a slightly different sort of historical analysis than was made earlier. Animals were equated with dumb bodies, man was equated with souls in that formula for the dualistic nature of man. And this is a quote from Berger. Until the 19th century, anthropomorphism was integral to the relations between man and animal and was an expression of their proximity. Today, we live without them. Descartes internalized with man the dualism implicit in the human relation to animals. And one of the figures that Berger particularly cites is the very popular mid-19th century illustrator J.J. Granville, who was, his most famous illustrations, and I'm sorry I don't have one of these images, is of dogs sort of disporting themselves like people wearing, Victorian clothing and sitting around smoking pipes, which have become so popularized that we tend to think of those as 20th century images, but in fact they go back to the middle of the 19th century, and all of them were meant to work as a kind of, social comedy of manners, comedy of morals, in fact, and sort of along the lines of Hogarth. Berger takes Granville's work as evidence that people had lost a sense of animals' innate identities. And I'm going to throw in here a very recent work that I think takes up something of the same theme. This is a new photograph by the photographer Vic Moon, and how this image was made, and I think it sort of sustains a theme that Berger was working on, is by assembling a basketball quart-size field of industrial garbage into, in this case, an image after Ang's painting of Oedipus confronting the Sphinx. So on the one hand, it's a sort of second-hand image, a reproduction of a canonical painting of, Oedipus in confrontation with one of these archetypal hybrid animals, the Sphinx, wise beyond the wisdom of men, puzzling Oedipus with this sort of life-altering series of questions. But it's also an image of the kind of depredations of the environment being reclaimed in the service of art, but also sort of standing at the margins of that experience, and a kind of grim warning of what we've done to our environment. So where this lecture began, apart from my interest in the relations between neuroscience and the contemporary visual arts, was with the understanding that an artist I'm particularly interested in, Rona Pondok, had based some of her artwork on the inspiration that came to her from dreams. Excuse me. And also that the work that she's been creating for the past half dozen years or so all involves hybridizations of herself. These are all self-portraits that are all derived from a single life cast she made of her own head, hybridizations with a number of different animals. And so from the, not heroic, but I think sufficient research to this point that I've done, I can say that her report that this image came to her from a dream, and I can say this even though I've become a pretty good friend of Rona's along the way, that this report is probably false or at least misremembered. It's unlikely that she had a dream in which she was in this case, dog-bodied, Rona-headed person. Nonetheless, it's an incredibly powerful image. These works are made out of cast stainless steel, colored stainless steel, which is an extremely difficult material to work with, very hard. And I think that resistance, that difficulty, and that sort of repellent shininess is part of the impact of this work. This is Otter. Dog was from 1998 to 2001. This is 2002 to 5. These sculptures take an awfully long time to complete. Muskrat.
What is the scale?
The scale is the dog is, her head is at life size. Let's see if I can go back to that. So it's about life size for a dog as well. And, roughly so are these. So they're about this big, about, 18 inches high. This is the one that's on the poster. Monkeys, an amazingly elaborate sculpture. These are life size for monkeys, so this is a pretty big installation. And finally, this is not really more recent, but a sort of digression from this body of work, Monkey with Hair, from 2002 to 3. And Pondok has more than once invoked Kafka, an important sort of transitional figure in discussions of hybridizations, his famous Gregor Samsa, who one morning woke up as a cockroach, in reference to this work. But as I said, she's also deeply interested in dreams as source material, which is a way of saying she's interested in internal as well as in cultural psychology. Of course, the reference to Kafka indicates that the language that is available to us as, citizens of a particular social world is part of what shapes her language as well. I think these recent hybrid works are especially astute about the distortions and fluidity of size, of proportion, of position that I think all of us know intuitively are associated with dreaming. That kind of distortion, where some body part or our relation to some other person's body is experienced as fluid and destabilizing is fundamental to that experience. Unbounded body parts, the sense that inappropriate exposure can't be prevented. Who hasn't had that dream? Vulnerability, I think all of these things are expressed with great power in this recent work. And there's also a very strange sense of remove, especially in the examples in which her head gets very small. A sense of, your body looming out there where your sense of conscious control has contracted to the size of a pin. I think it's significant that Pondok is much more interested in her own practice in looking at much older sculpture. She's more interested in Donatello, for instance, than she is in many of her peers. And I think it's also true that there are very few other explicitly sort of historical references for the work she's doing. In this field, Kiki Smith is sort of a looming presence, a longtime investigator of what it means to be embodied, to have boundaries, to find those boundaries porous. Similarly, she's had a long interest in enchantment and the fine line between alive and dead. Her work has come to be identified, and I think this has been to the detriment of its sustaining importance, with a certain kind of melancholy and debility, and I think, unfortunately as well, has often been associated with the term abjection, a kind of psychological prostration. And, I think that came from work that featured difficult subjects, menstruation, lactation, the release of other bodily fluids and solids, deflated seeming men and women, sometimes bent double on their hands and knees. I think actually the through line in Kiki Smith's work has been about this business of confounding inside and outside animation and its opposite. And so I think the fact that she's come to the business of hybridization again in the last half dozen or so years in her work is a step on that trajectory. It's not a quantum leap. In recent work, there's an awful lot of this kind of joint animal-human imagery. It also matters that Kiki Smith is an animal lover. She's particularly a bird lover. She used to keep about 30 doves and finches in her relatively small apartment, just flying around freely. She still has a few. Birds are really good pets, and they're incredibly smart. And I think and this distinguishes it from Rona's work, from other work. There is that kind of very close affection for animals in Kiki Smith's work, but undeniably there's also something much darker, very close to the spirit of fairy tales. The very first bird work, and here again I'm going to have to, contradict some of what I've already said, Getting the Bird Out. I don't have an image of it, which is from 1992, so this actually goes back quite a while. It was not a hybrid. Was in fact, she says, inspired by a dream, and the dream was of a female head with an open mouth from which a long string emerged, and there was a dead bird at the end, a kind of horrifying image. So I'm going to save myself by saying that's not quite a hybrid. But these bird-headed sirens and harpies, I'm showing them from an installation that was done in Central Park in 2004 in connection with the biennial that year, are clearly that sort of linking of animal and human that I've been talking about. Rapture, this is from 2001, shows a woman stepping out of what seems to be the carcass of a wolf. And I think you can extend a line back here all the way to Castor and Pollux, or to Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf. Born, these are images, these are sculptures that have gotten a fair amount of circulation. They're incredibly potent, again, life-size, and unlike Rona, all of Kiki Smith's work with animal imagery is at life size. That's important to her, and I think it's important to her commitment to preserving the naturalism and innate spiritual to her power of these animals. Born shows a deer delivering a fully grown woman who's sort of, she trails that deer sort of like a tail or like the train of a bridal gown. And, you know, I think it's possible to see through this work back to the work by which he was associated with the term abjection, because there were earlier works in which, you know, sort of women on their hands and knees were trailing menses or excrement. And I think it's interesting that she sort of turned that psychological experience around to this image that has an odd sort of dignity and even elegance. Kiki Smith says that this image comes from the Germanic legend of Saint Genoveffa, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, a queen who was falsely accused of infidelity and saved from execution when a huntsman spared her and abandoned her in the forest, where she survived for 6 years along with her daughter, and they were both nourished by a doe. I think this is about as far as she goes in that expression of hybridization. This is Wolf Girl from 1999. And I think those of you who heard Eleanor Hartney speak know that one of the things that's important to Kiki Smith in this imagery and a lot of her work is Catholicism. She was raised as a Catholic, and she has said, this is a quote of the artist, Catholicism is always involved in physical manifestations of spiritual conditions and is always taking inanimate objects and attributing meaning to them, close quote. Unlike Pondok, Kiki Smith has also said, my relationship to the figure isn't as close to sculptural history as it is to dolls and puppets. When you start making figures, you're in a sense making effigies, or you're making bodies. You're making physically bodies that spirits enter or occupy or have their own souls, presence, and physical space. So Kiki Smith is drawing a link between Catholicism and other non-Western religious systems in finding a historical basis for investing hybrid imagery in particular, spiritualized art objects across the board with a kind of animistic energy. All of which is very different from the way that Stephen Balkan All uses hybrids in his work. Balkan All is a German artist who, I'm going to go to a slightly better image, who's been using these sort of barnyard zoo animals in his work for some time. And what he's interested in, I think, is precisely the banality of these animal features as compounded with their street-clothed human bodies. The elephant-headed man is 2003. This figure is from the mid-90s, so that goes back a while. These three hybrids are from 1995. And Balkan All actually invites comparison to photography, commercial portraiture, to the well-known German photographers of his generation, Thomas Ruf, also the Swiss photographer Beat Stroili. These figures, unlike Kiki Smith's and Rona Pondok's, are slightly under life size, although he has also made heroically scaled human heads. There's a lot of facture to the surface, which is hard to see in the photograph. They're carved from cedar, which is very soft. And it's sort of surprising to see that facture in person, because otherwise there's not a whole lot of traction in this work. The pose, the dress, the faces, the unremarkableness of these subjects is what makes the animal heads, and I think it's striking that I think they actually don't read as masks, they read as people with animal heads, that you're sort of surprised at how readily you accept these completely, outlandish hybridizations. It's his success in sort of presenting these as, figures you could see walking down the street in these very casual, banal kinds of poses. I think this work is very close to the understanding of our relationships with animals that John Berger talks about. Also, I think Balkan All, and here he's closer to Kiki Smith than to Rona Pondok, is very receptive to a relationship with childhood images, with childishness itself. These could be circus animals. It's more likely they're circus animals or barnyard animals than wild ones. In Balkan All, there's very little engagement with mythic imagery, and there's absolutely no engagement with the romance and the melancholy and the fallen heroism that are associated with that imagery when it recurs in our time. Instead, he's looking at a very different kind of relationship, not just with animals, but with our experience of ourselves as animals. This is a work called Beastial by the artist Anne Chu. Again, very different from the last artist, from Stephen Balkan All. Anne Chu, I think, engages a whole host of ritual associations, both Western and Asian, in her work. She's done a fair amount of work that makes reference to bears, dancing bears, the habits of anthropocentrism that dancing bears reveal. This, I think, is likely some kind of bear. I wonder if I have, sorry, it's a little hard for me to see what I'm showing from here. And it's a marionette. It's made from wood, fabric, and wire. It's about the size of a very, very big person. And it's from a series of marionettes that she made at around this time, 2003. It has clawed feet, which suggest the bears that she had used in earlier works. The body is sort of indeterminate. It's not clear what kind of animal it is, even what gender it is. The head, I think, somehow seems male. I don't know why I say that. Sort of kind of aggression, maybe. And it seems, and I think this is unique among the works that we've looked at so far, it seems sort of shocked at, finding itself in this condition of being a hybrid. Of course, marionettes are always, in the position of being manipulated by others. That's part of the language, the symbolism of marionettes when they appear in the form of freestanding sculpture. They submit to the will of others the way compounds submit to, the will of the others that inhabit their bodies. But I think you get a sense from Beastial of, really what a pickle it is to be a hybrid, really what a kind of unfortunate predicament you find yourself in if you're, a bear waking up with the head of a human one day, which, I think is not that much of a stretch to see in Anne Chu's work as a kind of political metaphor, personal metaphor, being any kind of hyphenated being an Asian American artist, being Asian American woman artist. The hyphenated state is actually a social state as well as an internal psychological experience. She's made a series of what she calls Hellish Spirits. These are all from 2005. There are 9 of them in all. They're, well, that's not the right size. They're about 5 feet high. And they're made of smoke-fired ceramic, which I think is a material that in itself ties them to both her own tradition as an Asian artist, to the traditional ceramics of Asian cultures, and also to the cultural traditions that go with that work. Sorry, this is Beastial, the marionette that I was talking about, and it got plunked at the end. So here are the clawed feet and the male head and the strings that show its marionette. My apologies. This is a work on paper by Marcel Zama. A younger artist who's obviously very explicitly engaged with fairy tales and the wonder mixed with intimacy that, again, children have about animals. All of that is right on the surface in this work. I think with respect to Zama's work, it is interesting that children actually have no fear. I think this is a sort of clinical truth. Children have no fear of animals, dogs, for instance, until they're around 3, at which point, household animals begin to seem other and seem frightening. Until that point, they have a sense of sort of innocent familiarity, and you feel that innocent familiarity in all of Marcel Zama's work. He's a Canadian who worked as part of a collective called the Royal Art Lodge for several years, but for the last several years has been working independently, and I will show a number of his works on paper. Most of them, the individual images are on 14 by 11 sheets. The bigger ones get to be around 33 by 50 inches as compounds. And they have titles like Let Us Not Compare Mythologies. This is Sailors of the Red River. Shelley's Historic Mourning. So obviously what he's doing here is looking with both affection and irony and a certain sense of, what we've lost at a whole history of non-Western tribal representations of compound imagery and of how we use animals to hide behind, and in his work, of course, animals are very explicitly enlisted as masks to hide behind and also to express experiences that we otherwise have trouble being open about. And here I'm going to make a very brief digression to work that I think fits awkwardly in some ways into this sequence of images, but allows me to just acknowledge that one of the places that compound imagery, that hybrid imagery is inescapable is in comics and cartoons and Disney and Mickey Mouse and Looney Tunes. I mean, all those, talking, walking, hitting each other over the head. Cartoons that we all grew up with come in some sense from a very, very, very long history of hybrid images, and they are one of the reference points that Art Spiegelman used when he created his, sort of, in some ways, paradigm-shattering 2-volume book, Mouse, which is now about 20 years old, a sort of landmark in the entrance into the world scene of graphic novels, which are now having a kind of explosive presence in the art world. Mouse, as I'm sure most of you know, is a story of, it's a document of his father's experience in the Holocaust, and struggling with this material for a very long time. What Spiegelman came up with was this very sort of explicit, kind of dumb in a way, hybridization where the Germans were cats and the Jews were mice and the Poles were pigs, and it's all very blunt, and in a way allowed him to distance himself enough from the material that he could present it. Perhaps not the most comfortable transition in the world, but this is Matthew Barney as a goat. This is still from the first of the Cremaster movies to be released because of the very idiosyncratic way that Barney numbers his movies. This is, I think, called Cremaster 5, but it was the first one he made. Here is Barney looking very like, I think, in some ways, the aging Picasso, picturing himself as a sort of lewd but debonair kind of goat. In this film, that this is a still from, Barney is racing around the Isle of Man. And there are these very heavily stylized, ritualized activities ritualized and stylized with respect to a symbol system that is utterly hermetic, that has absolutely no historical reference, that is comprehensive. He's not engaging mythological systems or religious systems the way somebody like Kiki Smith does, or even somebody like Marcel Zama or even Ann Chu. Those of you familiar with his work know that it's an extremely heavily elaborated set of interlocking symbols that are utterly self-referential. It's more like The Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, I think, than other kinds of artwork using this kind of imagery that reach out to images circulating in the culture at large. And yet, it's incredibly sophisticated and unbelievably seductive on the level of just inventing images, producing things to see that have never been seen before. And I think it's very telling of Barney's work that he sort of introduced himself in some ways. I mean, this wasn't the very first body of work he did, but it was early on. He introduced himself in this, hybrid form, sort of very suavely combing back his hair without any discomfort at all to reveal those stumpy horns and that, those sort of floppy donkey or goat-like ears. The last artist whose work I'm going to show is Patricia Piccinini. She was born in 1965. And Piccinini is concerned in a very particular political sense with with the specter of hybrid monstrosities that that some think already have, been brought to life by bioengineering. So she's the only artist in this group who really addresses herself to the literal present issue of hybridization. And I think I found that of all the work that I considered for inclusion in this lecture, these are the only images that are really repellent. They're all from a series called We Are Family, 2003, and I'll just sort of run through them. The detail. It's the last one. I think it's true that frontiers are always scary places, geographical frontiers, the frontiers of science, and I think it's certainly true that many find themselves frightened about the frontiers that science has brought us to very recently. When she wrote about a very closely related series of work, Piccinini said, "Anyone who thinks that they can maintain control of the things they create is fooling themselves. Whether it is genetically modified canola, the cane toad, or work on the secondary market," here she's speaking to artists who have work that's left their studio and been sold and gone out of their control, or an image on the internet. Once the thing leaves our hands, all we can do is watch. And then she goes on to say that all of her work is about creation, birth, responsibility, babies. She was a new mother when she was making this work. And this is a quote, "the increasingly nebulous boundaries between the technological and the natural world," close quote. She also says that her work is about doing the wrong things for the right reasons. I think it's possible to see a kind of hysteria represented in or induced by, perhaps, Piccinini's work. Maybe it's not hysterical. I'm just going to, just before closing, throw in a few passages from a book by Lee Silver, a molecular biologist who teaches at Princeton, where he also has an appointment in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. And Silver writes that scientists have been mixing embryonic cells from different species, I don't know whether this is news to any of you, it was to me, for over 30 years. The cells don't fuse, but rather grow side by side to reproduce. Quote, "In February 1984, a remarkable beast that was part goat and part sheep appeared on the cover of the international science journal Nature. The geep, as it came to be known, had a mostly goat-like head. The rest of the body had both goat and sheep segments. According to its creator, Steen Willardson, the animal behaved like a goat, but did not quite smell like one, and preferred the company of sheep. Its sheep cells were male, but the sex of its goat cells was not known. It proved fertile in matings with ewes, that is female sheep, but has not so far with does, that is female goats. It was entirely worthy of its designation as a chimera, the mythological Greek monster, which was a mixture of a lion, a goat, and a snake, close quote. Silver goes on to note that the success of this procedure has led scientists to incorporate human stem cells into animal brains, mainly mice, to work out treatments for neurological diseases like Parkinsonism and Alzheimer's. Quote, some animals survived for over a year, that is some mice, with brains that were up to 25% human. Although they behaved like mice, they were clearly using human neurons to do at least part of their thinking. Close quote. Research is also proceeding on human organs in host animals, but, Silver notes, a mouse-sized brain filled with human cells can't produce anything remotely resembling human consciousness. After proposing a number of thought experiments on distinguishing humans from other animals, Silver claims that ultimately, and this I think is a very interesting observation, educated people may intellectualize the association of a human being with a human mind, but at the outset, our gut reactions are purely visual. Close quote. In other words, if it looks like an ape, we tend to consider it an ape no matter how many human cells it has in its brain. On the other hand, and this is where he ends this little essay, it's in a book that was just published in 2006. At some point in the future, I have no doubt, this is Silver speaking, science and society will move into the fuzzy area where we will be forced to draw an entirely arbitrary line between human beings and others. So I want to end by retreating a little bit from, this rather, I think, frightening prospect of how literally we've been able to, or at least have come close to, realizing what was once a social, cultural dream of hybridization, and sort of revert just for a very brief moment to the fact that these images do predate and possibly will outlast the inclination to bring them into being in the flesh. Hybrids are associated with a kind of social dreaming, to use a Jungian term, a cultural unconscious. Jung's theories are out of favor, I think with pretty good reason. He was, I think, in some ways presumptuous and bigoted. But without subscribing to Jungianism as a cultural theory or science, we can see that there are visual constructs that are to image repertories what Chomsky's deep structure seems to be for verbal language. In other words, hybrids are part of the night vision of visual representation. We feel intuitively that these hybrids should appear in dreams, even though they don't. And because of that, they tell us something about dreaming. And they leave us, I think, with as many questions as the problem of what we see when we sleep. Thank you.